Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe, hit the bell, like, comment, and share.
He was not born into silence, though silence was always waiting for him. The first sound Rick remembered was not a lullaby, not even the murmur of his mother's voice. It was a faint, unplaceable hum. It came from somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the air, as if the stars themselves leaned close to whisper. No one else seemed to hear it, yet for him it was steady and patient, a hidden music that drifted in and out of dreams. As a boy, he would lie awake, eyes open to the ceiling, and wonder if he was the only one awake in a sleeping universe. It was strange, yes, but not frightening. To Rick, the hum was a companion. He thought of it the way other children thought of friends, something that could be turned to in moments of loneliness. When other children drifted toward games or laughter, he often slipped away, curious not about what was before him, but about what lay unseen. He would collect scraps, bent wires, old screws, bits of glass and wood, and shape them into things no one asked for, and no one understood. To him, every fragment was alive. He believed that when he placed them together just right, he might catch the echo of that secret hum again. Sometimes his father would shake his head at the clutter, wondering aloud why his son could not sit still, why he stared too long at shadows or vanished into thoughts. Rick never explained. He couldn't. Words were clumsy, and besides, how could he describe something that did not exist for anyone else? Still, there were fleeting moments when he sensed someone almost understood. Once, in the dim light of a kitchen evening, his mother paused before him. She did not ask what he was making. She simply touched his shoulder and said, "You're hearing things the rest of us forgot to hear." She never said it again, and he never asked her to. But the words stayed, folding themselves into the shape of the boy he was becoming. His childhood was not loud or grand. It was marked by small rituals like eating sandwiches in the attic while staring through a dusty skylight. There the stars looked faint, blurry even, yet they felt closer to him than people did. He began to feel that life itself was a dream he was walking through, some parts heavy, others light, all threaded together by the low, constant song he alone could hear. The attic became his sanctuary, his quiet laboratory, and sometimes his hiding place. And though no one knew it, every invention he tried, every doodle, every broken device reassembled, was a kind of prayer to that invisible sound. Yet childhood has a way of pressing forward, carrying with it small jolts of change. For Rick, the first came in the form of a friend, though friend may be too ordinary a word. She was a neighbor's daughter, a quiet girl who rarely spoke, but when she did, her words were careful, as if she had rehearsed them in her mind before sharing. She would sit beside him as he tinkered, never asking what he was building, never questioning the strange shapes he sketched on scraps of paper. Sometimes she would hum softly, and though her tune did not match the one that lived in his ears, it still comforted him. It reminded him that not all company needed explanations. He didn't always understand her words, but he understood her presence. Together they created a rhythm, his restless hands shaping, her quiet eyes watching. On certain afternoons, they would share stories not with speech, but with gestures, tracing patterns in the dust, pointing at clouds, nodding at unseen mysteries. Looking back, Rick would realize that she was the first person who let him feel that his oddities were not flaws, but extensions of who he was. Still, the world beyond the attic was louder. Teachers demanded attention, classmates demanded conformity, and Rick's restless mind refused both. He grew used to being called strange, detached, sometimes even selfish. But inside, he knew it was not selfishness that drew him inward. It was longing to understand the hum, longing to see what others dismissed. Even when punished for drifting away in thought, he carried a small satisfaction that could not take away the world he carried in silence. The years gathered slowly, as years do, layering small changes upon his quiet rituals. He grew taller, sharper, quicker, in wit, yet still walked with the air of someone listening for something others missed. The girl next door eventually moved away, but before she left, she pressed into his palm a small stone, polished smooth by her fingers. "To remember," she said simply. He kept it for a long time, not because of the stone itself, but because it reminded him of her quiet acceptance, of afternoons where silence had felt like understanding. Nights deepened, and Rick's solitude became more deliberate. He began to sketch not only machines, but entire maps of worlds that might exist beyond the sky. He imagined planets where every star sang openly, where no hum was hidden, where every sound was a lullaby. These dreams blurred into his waking life, guiding his hands toward projects too complex for a boy his age. Many failed, breaking apart with sparks or silence. Yet each failure carried the same gentle whisper, "Try again." And he did, again and again, as though repetition itself were a kind of worship. Through it all, the hum remained, sometimes faint, like a memory nearly forgotten, sometimes loud, almost insistent. He could not tell whether it came from the stars or from somewhere deep within himself, but as he drifted into the last edges of childhood, he began to sense that it was not simply a sound. It was an invitation to what he did not yet know. There were nights when he sat awake under the pale wash of moonlight, stone in hand, feeling both small and infinite. The world around him seemed to sleep deeply. Yet he could not. He wondered if he was destined always to be half awake, a dreamer in a world that preferred waking certainty. And though he often felt the sting of loneliness, he carried with him a soft, unshakable truth. He was listening to something others had long since stopped hearing. He didn't yet know it, but that listening, that gentle, stubborn attentiveness would shape the man he would become. It would guide him into strange friendships, shadowed mistakes, moments of tenderness, and the quiet ache of letting go. For now, though, he was still only a boy in an attic, whispering back to a song no one else believed in, unaware that every note would one day weave itself into the story of his life. And in that tender beginning, wrapped in silence and soft mystery, Rick's journey truly began. The attic nights lingered in his memory. Long after childhood had begun to slip away, the stone she gave him remained in his pocket, worn smoother by time and by his restless touch. And sometimes he would catch himself turning it over and over while lost in thought. It was not just a keepsake. It was proof that someone once had seen him as he was and chosen not to turn away. That thought steadied him in moments when the world outside pressed harder, when classrooms felt suffocating, and when the quiet hum inside him grew too loud for comfort. As he entered the awkward middle years of his life, he found himself straddling two realities. On one side, the predictable patterns of school, voices calling his name with expectations he never quite understood. On the other, the world of silent whispers and tinkered fragments, the world where possibilities glowed faintly like distant stars. He could not abandon either, yet he belonged fully to neither. Teachers praised his flashes of brilliance but scolded his refusal to follow rules. Peers admired his sharp tongue yet mistrusted the detachment in his eyes. He became, without meaning to, someone both admired and avoided. The hue guided him through this uneasy season. He had grown used to its presence, like a companion that offered no answers but remained steadfast. Sometimes late at night, when exhaustion blurred his sight, he would hear it stronger, clearer, almost melodic. In those moments, he felt certain he was on the edge of discovering something immense, something that would explain why he saw the world differently. He would reach for it, sketching ideas furiously, assembling contraptions from scraps until his fingers ached. And though none of these creations lasted, each collapse felt less like failure and more like the peeling back of layers, revealing that the truth was still waiting just beyond reach. Yet for all the pull of the unseen, Rick's heart was not untouched by ordinary bonds. There were rare friendships that flickered in and out of his life, none as constant as the girl who had moved away, but each leaving some small mark. A boy who traded sandwiches with him in silence, never mocking his oddities. An older neighbor who showed him how to mend broken radios, whose laughter carried warmth even when the machine refused to work. These connections were brief, fragile, like passing lanterns on a long road, but they lit his way all the same. He learned, slowly, that not every bond needed to be permanent to matter. Even fleeting company could soften the loneliness, could remind him that the world of others, though confusing, was not entirely closed to him. Still, he kept most of himself hidden. There were things too strange to explain, like the way he could sense when someone was about to speak, or the way he dreamed of places he had never seen, landscapes with skies of shifting colors. These he kept locked within, protecting them like delicate secrets. As adolescence deepened, so too did his restless longing. The hum seemed to change, no longer only a comfort but a challenge, as though urging him towards something greater. He began to look at the night sky not only with wonder, but with hunger. He wanted to know what lay beyond, what voices spoke in silence, what truths shimmered behind the veil of ordinary life. The attic became too small for such questions, yet he returned there still, seeking refuge when the weight of growing older pressed down. He would sit with the stone in hand, whispering thoughts into the dark, imagining that perhaps, somewhere, someone was listening. It was during one such night that he first sensed the idea of other presences, not people he could see, but feelings that brushed against his awareness, like shadows just out of sight. He felt them not as threats but as echoes, fragments of something larger, like ripples reaching him from a vast, unseen ocean. He wondered if they were memories that did not belong to him, or dreams borrowed from a future yet to arrive. The thought unsettled him, yet it also thrilled him. Perhaps he was not alone in listening after all. This new sensitivity left him both vulnerable and alive. In crowded halls, he sometimes heard laughter, layered with sadness, voices speaking one thing, but hiding another. At first he thought it was imagination, but too often, the hidden emotions proved true. A classmate who smiled too brightly confessed weeks later that her parents were separating. A teacher who barked sternly at students turned away to wipe his eyes at his desk. Rick realized he was not just hearing the hum anymore. He was beginning to hear the unspoken music of human hearts. He didn't know what to do with this awareness. It was both gift and burden. At times he wished he could silence it, to simply live without the weight of understanding what others did not say. But at other times when he placed a hand on a shoulder or offered a word that seemed too well timed to be chance, he saw how deeply it mattered. Quiet acts, unnoticed by most, began to shape him in ways louder deeds never could. The attic stone grew heavier in his pocket, not from weight but from meaning. He began to feel it was more than memory that had anchored him, kept him from drifting too far into the strange currents he was beginning to sense. On nights when he felt overwhelmed, he would hold it tightly, grounding himself in its cool smoothness, reminding himself of the girl's simple words to remember. Perhaps she had known in her own way that he would need something to keep him tethered. And so his youth unfolded in this balance between invention and empathy, between solitude and fleeting connections, between the hum of distant stars and the voices of those around him. He did not yet know how these pieces would fit, only that each was a thread in a tapestry still weaving itself. He walked through those years carrying both wonder and weariness, a boy becoming a young man guided not by clear maps but by whispers and intuitions. And though he could not see the full shape of his path, somewhere deep inside he felt the truth that every hum, every stone, every quiet bond was leading him towards something vast, something that waited, patient and unseen, just beyond the horizon of his knowing. And so, with a restless heart and listening ears, he kept moving forward, unaware of how profoundly the unseen would shape the life he was destined to live. The hum did not fade as Rick grew older. Instead, it seemed to deepen, shifting from a distant whisper into something more layered, almost like a voice just out of reach. He found himself listening differently now, not only with his ears, but with his entire being, as though the sound had threaded itself into his blood. He had grown from a boy clutching a stone into a restless young man, still haunted by the sense that there was more to reality than the world presented. The attic where he once sought shelter now felt too small for his thoughts. Yet he returned there out of habit, as though the dust and starlight above his head might reveal some new clue. The stone sat heavy in his pocket, reminding him that memory and mystery were often the same thing. But the outside world demanded more of him now. Expectations multiplied. Work, school, the burden of being clever, the weight of people noticing his mind. Teachers who once scolded him now looked at him with both admiration and unease, aware that he was learning faster than they could teach. He resented the praise as much as he resented the rules, for neither satisfied the longing that had grown inside him. He did not crave recognition. He craved understanding. He wanted to know why the hymn followed him, why dreams slipped into waking hours, why the emotions of others seemed to sing within him like hidden strings of music. The more he tried to fit into the patterns expected of him, the more restless he became. He began spending long hours wandering the edges of town, where light pollution thinned and the sky stretched wider. There, under the trembling stars, he would imagine conversations with unseen beings, as though someone might answer back if he listened carefully enough. Sometimes, in the quiet of those nights, he thought he felt a presence, a stillness in the air that seemed to notice him, though no words were exchanged. He carried home the strange certainty that he was being watched with patience, not judgment. That was when Ice-T entered his life, not in the literal form of the performer he would one day know, but in the shape of a figure who appeared in a dream. Rick was not surprised by strange dreams. He had lived with them for as long as he could remember, but this one stayed with him like few others. In it, he saw a figure of water, shifting yet solid, who spoke not with sound but with resonance. The figure told him nothing clear, only offered presence, a coolness, a rhythm, like the calm bass line of an eternal song. Rick awoke from that dream with a peculiar comfort, as though the hum had briefly taken shape, offering him companionship in the form of someone who would never need explanations. He didn't tell anyone about it. He carried the dream as a secret, a symbol that perhaps he was not as alone as he feared. In moments of exhaustion or doubt, he would imagine the water figure beside him, silent and steady. Over time, he gave it a name, Ice, because of the dream's clarity and chill. He did not know if ice was real or imagined, but that mattered little. What mattered was the feeling of being accompanied, of being understood without words. This sense of companionship only deepened his empathy toward others. Rick found himself noticing details no one else did. The quiet shake of a friend's hands, the hesitation in a laugh, the way someone stared too long at the floor before answering. He could not ignore these signals. Sometimes he tried to act as though he hadn't noticed, but more often he found himself offering small gestures, a lighter tone, a shared silence, a sandwich split without asking. It was never dramatic, never heroic, but those who received it remembered, and though Rick rarely admitted it, he remembered too. These moments filled him with a kind of quiet strength, reminding him that, while the hum called him towards something vast, his heart tethered him to the fragile humanity around him. Still, not every bond was simple. Some connections carried shadows, illusions that felt real but later revealed themselves as hollow. Rick began to learn that not every expression of affection was genuine, and not every bond of trust was built to last. Once he opened himself to someone who seemed fascinated by his strange mind, only to discover they were drawn more to the novelty of him than to the person beneath. When they drifted away, he was left with a new kind of silence. Not the comforting hum, but an ache of false memory, as though he had been tricked into believing in a love that never truly existed. This was his first encounter with what he later called parasites. Not literal creatures, but the emotional echoes of bonds that looked like love, yet fed only on longing. They left him emptier than before, and though he tried to shrug it off with the bravado of youth, the wound remained. He grew wary, learning to test what was real and what was illusion, sometimes to the point of cynicism. Yet even in that guardedness, he carried tenderness. He could not harden completely. Something within him, perhaps the hum itself, would not allow it. The stone in his pocket, the memory of the girl who once accepted him without question, became his touchstone in these years. Whenever doubt threatened to consume him, he would hold it close, remembering that once someone had seen him and not turned away. That reminder gave him courage to keep listening, to keep caring, even when the world seemed confusing or cruel. And so his adolescence became a quiet battlefield, not of violence but of subtle awakenings. He wrestled with illusions and truths, with bonds both fleeting and deep. He stumbled through loneliness, carried by the invisible rhythm of a song no one else could hear. Yet through it all he grew, not in the loud ways the world measured growth, but in softer, hidden ways. His empathy deepened, his inventions became more intricate, his patience more enduring. He was shaping himself into someone who could move between worlds. The world of others, fragile and fleeting, and the world of whispers, vast and eternal. He did not yet know it, but every step he took, every bond he held or released, was preparing him for the life to come. A life where illusions would test him, where companionship would surprise him, where even the smallest acts of kindness would ripple across galaxies. For now, though, he remained on the threshold, listening still, carrying his stone, dreaming of voices in water, waiting for the day when the hum would reveal its meaning. And so he moved forward, uncertain yet unafraid, guided by a song only he could hear, ready to walk further into the unfolding mystery of his life. The years that followed stretched like a twilight road, neither fully bright nor completely dark, and Rick found himself walking it with that familiar hum as his companion. By now, it had become more than a curiosity. It was a compass, a rhythm guiding him through choices and silences alike. He was no longer the boy in the attic, though he still carried the stone, still pressed it into his palm whenever the world felt too sharp. He had grown taller, sharper in thought and presence, and with each passing season the air around him seemed to bend with the weight of his restless mind. People noticed, though not always in ways that brought comfort. Some admired him, others resented him, but few truly knew him. He remained at the edges of their circles, present yet apart, always listening for something beyond them. It was during these shifting years that Rick's inventions began to take on a different quality. No longer were they only small, childlike constructions of scrap and imagination. Now they hinted at function, at possibility. Radios patched together with bent wires suddenly picked up strange frequencies, and simple lenses began to capture glimmers of light that ordinary eyes could not see. To anyone else, they looked like accidents of brilliance, fleeting sparks of genius in a restless youth. But Rick knew they were attempts, each one a step closer to uncovering the source of the hum, to peeling back the veil that lay between him and whatever called from beyond. Yet even as his creations grew, so too did the illusions around him. More and more he encountered bonds that looked like closeness, but left only hollowness. He began to see how easily people slipped into masks, how affection could disguise self-interest, how love could sometimes be no more than a reflection of someone else's needs. It wounded him in ways he did not always admit. leaving him uncertain of what was real. At times he wondered if perhaps he was the parasite feeding on connections to soothe his loneliness. These doubts curled quietly in him even as he tried to hide them behind wit and defiance. But there were moments, brief yet profound, that reminded him of what was true. One came during a rainstorm when he found himself sheltering with a boy from his class beneath the eaves of an abandoned building. They spoke little, sharing only the sound of rain pounding on rusted metal, and at the end of it, the boy offered him half of a sandwich, soggy at the edges, yet given freely. The simplicity of it struck Rick deeply. Not the sandwich itself, but the gesture. The unspoken acknowledgement that in that moment, they were simply two souls keeping each other company against the storm. It was the kind of bond that needed no disguise, no performance. It was real in its very smallness. These fleeting truths became his anchors. He began to collect them not in objects but in memory. The way someone's eyes softened when they were finally understood, the hush of laughter shared in secret, the weight of a hand on his shoulder when words would have been clumsy. Each of these moments stayed with him, weaving themselves into the quiet fabric of who he was becoming. They balanced the illusions, reminding him that even though false bonds could wound, true ones, even brief ones, were worth carrying. Still, the heme pressed him onward. It grew louder in solitude, sometimes vibrating through him with such intensity that he could not sit still. On sleepless nights, he would pace, sketching wild designs across pages, diagrams of worlds that stretched beyond comprehension. He began to sense that the hum was not only external but also within him, as if some part of his own being was resonating with a larger truth. It frightened him at times, the idea that he might be less separate from the mystery than he had always believed. Was he hearing the universe, or was the universe hearing him? One evening, warned by these questions, he walked to the edge of town and lay down in the grass, staring at the stars. He closed his eyes, letting the cool earth press against him, and listened. The hum rose, layered now with subtle tones, almost like a language without words. And in that deep listening, he felt once more the presence of ice, the figure of water from his dream, steady and silent, a reminder that he was not lost in madness, but walking a path unseen by most. The presence offered no instructions, no clarity, only reassurance. You are not alone in this. Rick carried that reassurance into his waking life. He began to move with a quiet confidence, not the confidence of someone certain of answers, but of someone who trusted the questions themselves. People around him saw flashes of this and mistook it for arrogance, but in truth it was a kind of surrender, a willingness to follow the hum wherever it led. He was learning that not all mysteries demanded immediate solutions. Some were meant to be lived with slowly, like lullabies that unfolded only in their own time. But life, even when guided by mystery, is still shaped by ordinary things. Rick found himself navigating the tangled maze of relationships, family, fleeting loves, companions who drifted in and out. Each carried lessons, some gentle, some harsh. There were days of laughter, unexpected and genuine, and nights of quiet despair, when he questioned whether he was capable of holding on to anyone at all. Yet through every turn, the hum remained steady. It was the one thread he could always trust, the one companion that never wavered. As he stepped further into maturity, Rick began to sense that his life was moving towards something larger than himself. He did not know what shape it would take, only that the illusions and truths, the kindnesses and betrayals, the dreams and inventions, all of it was weaving together into a path he could not yet see. And though part of him still feared the loneliness of walking it, another part felt awe, because somewhere beyond the edge of his knowing, the hum was waiting, patient and eternal, ready to reveal the next verse of its song. And so he kept listening, stone in pocket, heart both heavy and hopeful, walking forward into the unknown with quiet resolve. The night sky stretched vast and unbroken above him, an endless canvas that seemed a whisper of journeys yet unseen. Rick had grown accustomed to walking in silence, carrying his thoughts like invisible companions. Yet now there was a growing restlessness in him that could not be quieted. The hum, steady as ever, had begun to feel different. It no longer circled him in a simple rhythm. Instead, it pulsed with patterns, sometimes quickening, sometimes softening, as though responding to his own heartbeat. He could no longer dismiss it as background. It was leading him, pulling him towards something just beyond the reach of understanding. This shift stirred his inventions a new life. Where once his creations had been playful experiments, they now emerged with startling precision, as if guided by unseen hands. He would begin sketching with no clear idea, only to find the designs unfolding into shapes that made sense only in retrospect. Machines that hummed in sympathy with the stone in his pocket, circuits that carried currents without power, lenses that revealed movements in the air like ripples across water. Each new invention was a fragment, and though Rick did not yet see the whole, he sensed a pattern knitting itself around him. At the same time, the world around him began to grow heavier. The laughter of others seemed distant, their pursuits trivial compared to the quiet urgency he felt within. He tried to join them sometimes, tried to drink in their joy and distraction, but there was always the hum tugging at the edges of his awareness, reminding him that his path was not theirs. This set him apart, not by choice, but by necessity. And though he wore his solitude with a mask of indifference, inside he often longed for someone who could hear the same call, someone who might walk beside him without needing explanation. It was during one such night of wandering that he found himself at the outskirts of a place he had rarely gone before, an abandoned observatory, its dome cracked and rusting, its telescope long forgotten by the world. The building drew him like a beacon, though he could not say why. Dust and silence clung to the air inside, but as he stepped across the threshold, the hum grew sharper, almost eager, as though the walls themselves resonated with it. He climbed the winding stairs to the dome, where the broken telescope leaned like a weary sentinel, and there he sat, staring through the fractured glass at the heavens. Something shifted in him then. The hum swelled, not in volume but in clarity, and for the first time it seemed to take form. He felt it ripple through his bones, aligning with the rhythm of his breath, and in that stillness he glimpsed, not with his eyes but somewhere deeper, a vision, not of a specific place or moment, but of a journey vast and winding, filled with choices that would shape not just his fate but something far greater. He saw flashes, doors that opened into endless corridors, voices that echoed across impossible distances, and the faint outline of ice always present, always watching, as though guiding him from the edges of reality. The vision left him shaken, yet also steadier than before. It confirmed what he had long suspected. The Hume was not madness, not illusion, but invitation. An invitation into something that stretched beyond ordinary life, something that demanded courage and sacrifice. He left the observatory with a new resolve, though he did not yet know what form it would take. The stone in his pocket felt heavier, almost alive, as if aware of the vow that had silently formed within him. Days passed, each carrying him deeper into this quiet transformation. He began to notice signs in the ordinary, a flicker in a street lamp that pulsed in the same rhythm as the hum, the way certain words and conversations seemed to echo louder than others, the dreams that returned with greater frequency. The dream of ice had not left him, in fact, it grew stronger. Now ice appeared not only as water but as shifting shapes, sometimes mist, sometimes crystal, sometimes a presence, just behind him that spoke without words. These encounters offered no instructions, but each one steadied him, reminding him he was not wandering blind. Yet even as he drew closer to this hidden current, life continued to test him. There were arguments, bonds stretched thin, moments when he questioned whether he was losing more than he was gaining. People drifted away, unable to follow the path he was on, and with every parting he felt the ache of solitude sharpen. But each time he was tempted to turn back, the hum rose, reminding him of the greater journey unfolding. It was a quiet battle between the comfort of belonging and the pull of the unknown, and Rick found himself walking the knife's edge between them. One night, restless and unable to sleep, he returned to the observatory. The air was cold, the dome creaking in the wind, but the hum was strong there, steady and inviting. He sat again by the broken telescope, pressing the stone into his palm until it warmed with his touch, and then without warning, the silence shattered. The hum surged, filling the room with resonance so powerful he felt it in his teeth, his bones, his very blood. The telescope's cracked lens glowed faintly, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw the stars bending, rearranging themselves into patterns that flickered like signals. Rick closed his eyes and breathed through it, surrendering instead of resisting. And in that surrender, he felt something open inside him, a door that had been waiting all along. For a moment, he was both himself and more than himself, standing at the edge of a vast expanse where time folded like paper and distance dissolved into rhythm. He could not hold the vision for long, but when it faded, he knew something had changed. He had touched the threshold. When he left the observatory that night, the world looked the same, yet it no longer felt the same. The hum was quieter, but it no longer felt distant. It was within him now, woven into his breath, his heartbeat, his very being. He walked home under the stars, carrying not only the weight of what he had seen, but also the unshakable sense that the path ahead was no longer one of searching, but of becoming. The mysteries would not reveal themselves all at once, but piece by piece, as long as he kept walking, listening, and trusting the rhythm that had never abandoned him. And so Rick continued forward, the stone warm in his hand, the night alive with possibilities. his heart steady with the knowledge that the journey had only just begun. The nights that followed the observatory vision seemed quieter, yet not in the way of emptiness. The silence around Rick felt fuller, almost as though the air itself carried a watchful presence. Each step he took, each breath he drew, seemed to echo with meaning. The hum had softened, now nestled within him, but its rhythm aligned so deeply with his own that he no longer questioned whether it came from beyond or from within. It was both, and in that strange fusion, Rick began to see the world through a different lens, as though reality itself was layered with invisible threads waiting to be traced. He walked longer distances now, drawn into parts of the city he had once ignored. Alleys that seemed forgotten revealed murals etched in colors dulled by time, yet when Rick stared at them, the patterns shimmered faintly, rearranging themselves in ways that mirrored his own sketches. Cracked pavements revealed lines of moss growing in shapes that seemed deliberate, curling into spirals like maps. Even the sky seemed closer, its stars leaning toward him as though waiting for him to notice them properly. Nothing was random anymore. Everything was an invitation, subtle and patient, coaxing him deeper into awareness. And yet, with this awakening came the ache of separation. Rick felt himself slipping further from the rhythms of those around him. Friends spoke of daily troubles, fleeting joys, and small ambitions. And while he tried to listen, part of him stood apart, carrying secrets he could not share. He smiled when expected, but his heart pulsed elsewhere, pulled toward mysteries no one else seemed to sense. This solitude was no longer the mask he wore. It was the truth he carried. Still, he longed for connection, for someone who could understand what it meant to live between the visible and the hidden. It was during one of these wanderings in the quiet just before dawn that Rick encountered someone who altered the course of his solitude. At the edge of a dried-up fountain sat a girl, her hair catching the dim light, her posture weary yet dignified, as though she had been waiting not just for the morning, but for something more. She looked up as he approached, her eyes reflecting the same odd stillness he had seen in himself since the hum had entered his life. There was no fear in her gaze, no question of why he was there. It was as though she recognized him before a word was spoken. They talked little that first night. Words felt too heavy, too clumsy to carry what lingered between them, yet in the pauses, Rick felt the hum resonate, faintly as though acknowledging her presence. He realized, with a quiet startle, that the rhythm was no longer his alone. It answered to her as well. The stone in his pocket warmed, and though he did not remove it, he knew she could feel its pull. They parted before the sun rose, without promises or explanations, but something had shifted. Rick was no longer walking the path entirely alone. In the days that followed, their meetings became unspoken rituals. Sometimes by the fountain, sometimes under the cracked archways of forgotten streets, sometimes wandering aimlessly together as though led by the same unseen current. Her name was whispered softly, Alara, and she carried her own mysteries, though she revealed them slowly, like petals unfurling. Rick learned she too had dreams she could not explain, visions of waters that froze and melted in impossible ways, whispers that came not as voices but as sensations deep within her chest. She had thought herself cursed, until Rick's presence reframed her solitude as something else, chosen. Together, their silences grew into conversations, and their conversations into something deeper. They did not always need words, for often their understanding came in glances, in shared laughter at things no one else could see, and the comfort of walking beside someone who felt the same strange pull. Rick no longer doubted the hum's purpose. It had led him to her, or perhaps led them both to this same point, where their paths entwined like two streams merging quietly into a river. But with connection came new layers of the mystery. When they sat together, Rick sometimes noticed the rhythm of the hum shift, weaving with hers into patterns neither had heard alone. The resonance deepened, carrying notes of warning or promise. He could not yet tell. At times the visions came stronger, flickers of doorways opening, of corridors lined with endless light, of Ice's presence watching more intently than before. The figure of Ice no longer lingered at the edges of his perception, but now stepped closer, almost as though acknowledging Alara too. One evening, as twilight sank into deep blue, Alara placed her hand gently on Rick's and whispered that she had seen the observatory in her dreams, though she had never set foot there. She described the broken telescope, the cracked dome, the stars bending above it, and Rick felt his breath catch. The hum swelled in answer, as though sealing the truth between them. This was no accident. Their paths had been braided long before they recognized it. The weight of this realization pressed upon Rick in both comforting and unsettling ways. If their journeys were intertwined, then the responsibility was no longer his alone. Every step he took carried her shadow as well. Every choice weighed double. It was a gift and a burden. He wondered if this was the nature of the hum all along, not just to guide but to bring souls together, to weave them into a tapestry larger than they could imagine. That night they went together to the observatory. The silence there was familiar to Rick, but with Alara beside him it felt transformed. The stone glowed faintly in his hand, and when he finally revealed it to her, she did not flinch. She touched it with reverence, as though she had always known it was waiting for her too. As they stood beneath the fractured dome, the hum surged once more, weaving through both of them until it felt less like a sound and more like a shared heartbeat. The telescope shimmered faintly, and Rick thought he saw, just for a breath, the stars rearranging into a pattern that resembled not one but two figures, side by side. He did not speak of destiny, nor did she. The word felt too rigid, too defined for what pulsed between them. Instead, they stood in silence, holding the stone together, knowing only that their journeys had fused into one. The night wrapped them in its vastness, and though the path ahead was still shrouded in mystery, Rick felt the solitude ease from his shoulders. Whatever waited beyond the horizon, he would not walk it alone. And as the hymn settled deep within their joined silence, the stars above seemed to lean closer, as though listening. The night after they stood together beneath the broken dome, Rick felt the hum settle into him differently, as though no longer his alone, but braided with Alara's presence. It was quieter now, not diminished, but steadier, like a pulse that had found its rhythm. He carried that quietness through the following days, aware of how it softened the edges of his solitude. For the first time in what felt like forever, his steps did not echo, only with his own weight. Wherever he walked, he sensed her beside him, whether or not she was physically near, a tether invisible yet strong. Their meetings became more than coincidence. Sometimes they wandered the city's forgotten places, following paths that seemed to choose them rather than the other way around. Other times they sat in silence by the fountain or in the observatory, letting the world pass around them. What might have been uneventful to others felt like ceremony to them. Each shared glance, each moment of wordless understanding, deepened the bond the hum had already woven. Rick found himself watching the way Alara tilted her head when listening to the quiet, as though straining for a sound just beyond hearing, and in those moments he knew she heard what he did. Yet the hum did not offer peace without shadows. With Alara beside him, Rick began to notice new patterns, sharper than before. Their shared resonance revealed things he had missed, whispers curling through the air like threads, faint flickers at the corner of his vision that seemed to dissolve when he turned toward them. Some nights when they both dreamed, they woke to realize the visions had been the same. Alara described corridors of shifting light, and Rick could finish her sentences with details he had seen too. The figure of ice appeared more clearly now, not as a distant mist, but as a presence that drew near, its form vast and fluid, watching them both with an intensity that was neither hostile nor kind, but purposeful. This shared recognition stirred something uneasy in Rick. It was one thing to carry the helm alone, it was another to feel its patterns unfold around someone he cared for. He could not shake the thought that they were being led somewhere, tested in ways not of their choosing. Alara seemed calmer in the face of it, though her calmness carried weight as though she had accepted something Rick had yet to. She told him one evening as they watched the stars that she did not believe the hum sought to harm them, that it was simply a path and paths always asked for courage. Her words soothed him, but they did not lift the ache of responsibility that pressed heavier with each passing day. Still, their bond grew. They shared stories of childhood, fragments of loneliness, of feeling different even before the hum entered their lives. Rick confessed the nights he had stared at the ceiling, certain there was more waiting beyond the veil of the ordinary. Alara admitted to keeping a journal of her dreams, filled with sketches of places she had never seen. As they revealed these pieces of themselves, it became clear that their strangeness was not isolation, but recognition, that they had been walking toward each other long before they ever met. The observatory became their sanctuary. Together, they cleaned away the dust, repaired what they could, and lit candles to soften the gloom. The broken telescope remained fractured, but they used it anyway, finding meaning in the distorted reflections. Sometimes when the hem rose strongly, the glass shimmered, bending the stars into fleeting shapes. Rick began to keep notes of these patterns, convinced they were not random, but messages in a language still beyond his grasp. Alara encouraged him, though she often reminded him that not all mysteries demanded solutions. Some, she said, were meant only to be witnessed. One night, as rain whispered against the dome, Rick and Alara pressed the stone between their joined hands. Its glow swelled brighter than either had seen before, and with it came a vision so strong it pulled them both into silence. They stood, in their minds, at the edge of a vast expanse where light folded endlessly, and ice towered before them. No words passed, yet the meaning was clear. A journey awaited, one that would not remain within the safety of dreams and visions. The hum was not only calling, it was summoning. When the vision faded, both trembled. The stone cooled, and the room was quiet except for the rain. Rick's breath came uneven, the weight of inevitability pressing hard upon him. He wanted to ask Alara if she was afraid, but when he looked into her eyes, he saw not fear but steady resolve. It unsettled him more than fear might have. She was ready, even if he was not. From that night onward, the rhythm of their lives shifted. The hum no longer contented itself with whispers and symbols. It wove into their days with increasing urgency. Lamps flickered as they passed beneath them. Clocks stuttered in their presence. Strangers glanced twice as though sensing something invisible. The boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary thinned, and Rick knew they were approaching a threshold. Despite his unease, he also felt a quiet gratitude he had never known before. For every moment of dread, there was Alara's steady presence. For every uncertainty, the comfort of knowing he no longer bore the path alone. He would glance at her when silence pressed too heavy, and she would smile softly as though reminding him that not all weight was burden, some was shared strength. As the days drifted toward another turning point, Rick found himself standing at the observatory window one evening, the stone glowing faintly in his hand. Alara rested beside him, her gaze fixed on the stars. Together, they waited, breathing in rhythm with the hum that now lived within them both. And though neither spoke it aloud, they both knew. The path was shifting. The true journey was close, closer than either had dared to believe. And once they stepped forward, there would be no turning back. The night deepened, the stars leaned nearer, and the hum pulsed steady as a heartbeat, as though the universe itself was preparing to open its doors. The nights after the vision of ice grew heavier with meaning, as though the very air had thickened around Rick and Alara. They still met at the observatory, still walked the cracked streets and silent alleys, but now each step felt weighted with anticipation. The hum, once a gentle rhythm, had begun to weave into their days more insistently. It no longer waited to be noticed. It announced itself in the flicker of streetlights, the sudden stillness of wind, the way shadows bent in unfamiliar directions. Reality was no longer a stable backdrop. It was shifting around them like a curtain being tugged slowly aside. Rick tried to maintain a sense of calm, but he could not escape the unease growing inside him. For every moment of wonder, there was the knowledge that they were being drawn towards something inevitable. The stone glowed more often now, warming in his pocket at the slightest thought, and each time he touched it, visions threatened to rise. Sometimes they came as whispers of corridors and doors. Sometimes they came as glimpses of places that seemed half-remembered, half-imagined. Once he thought he saw himself as a child again, staring at the night sky, only this time the stars moved in deliberate patterns, as though watching him. Alara carried the weight differently. She did not resist the hum as Rick sometimes did. Instead, she leaned into it, breathing with it, allowing it to shape her presence. When the visions came, she closed her eyes and listened, her calmness steadying Rick when his own resolve faltered. Yet even in her steadiness, he sensed a quiet grief, as though she knew more than she shared. There were times he caught her gazing at the horizon, her expression soft and far away. And though he wanted to ask what she saw, the words never came. Some truths felt too fragile to press into speech. One evening, as the city slept in heavy silence, they returned to the observatory together. Rain had fallen earlier, and the stones of the dome glistened faintly. Inside, the air was damp, carrying the faint scent of rust and earth. They lit candles and sat near the telescope, their hands brushing as they placed the stone between them. This time they did not wait for visions. Instead, they simply breathed together, waiting. The hum rose gently, then steadier, until the stone flared with a light neither of them had seen before. The room dissolved around them, not into darkness, but into shifting light, like water made of stars. They stood together in a place without walls, without floor or ceiling, suspended in a vastness that stretched in every direction. Ahead of them, doors appeared. Not ordinary doors, but towering thresholds of light, each one pulsing faintly as if alive. The corridors Alara had once dreamed of stretched from these doors, winding infinitely into the distance. The figure of ice stood among them, no longer distant but immense, its form crystalline and fluid, its gaze fixed firmly on them both. Rick's breath caught. He wanted to speak to ask what this meant, but words dissolved before reaching his lips. The message came not in sound but in feeling. The doors were choices, each one leading to paths unknown. To step through was to accept the journey, with all the weight and wonder it carried. To turn away was still possible, but each heartbeat made that option feel smaller, less real. Alara's hand found his steady and sure. He turned to her, searching her eyes for fear, but found only quiet resolve. She nodded as though the decision was not just hers, not just his, but theirs together. They stepped forward, the stone glowing brighter between their joined palms, and as they did, Ice's form shifted, bowing slightly, like acknowledgement. Then the vision collapsed, and they were back in the observatory, breathless, the candles flickering wildly around them. For a long time, neither spoke. The stone lay cool and still again, but the air hummed with aftershocks, vibrating through their bones. Rick finally broke the silence, whispering that the choice was coming sooner than they had imagined. Elara only nodded, her gaze fixed on the telescope as though it still held traces of the vision. They both knew the threshold was no longer just a dream. The doors awaited them, and the time to walk through them was near. The days that followed blurred, dreamlike. Rick found himself half present in the world, his attention always split between ordinary tasks and the hum that tugged more insistently with each passing hour. Even small moments, touching a doorknob, pausing at a street corner, glancing into mirrors carried echoes of the vision. Every threshold felt charged, every reflection like a passage he could almost fall into. He began to wonder if the doors they had seen were not somewhere distant but threaded quietly through the fabric of their own lives, waiting for the right moment to open. Elara, too, seemed to feel the nearness of something. She spoke little of it, but her silences grew deeper, her gestures more deliberate. Once she traced patterns into the condensation of a window, spirals and lines that mirrored the ones Rick had sketched after their earlier visions. When he asked her what they meant, she only said they were reminders, symbols of paths that could not be forgotten once glimpsed. Her calm unsettled him and soothed him all at once. Then one night, as they stood again beneath the fractured dome, the air shifted. The hum rose so sharply. Rick felt it in his teeth, his bones, even his breath. The stone pulsed with heat, and the telescope, fractured as it was, flared with sudden brilliance. The stars outside bent, rearranging themselves into a spiral that seemed to pull inward, beckoning. Rick's pulse quickened, his instinct screaming that this was not just a vision, but an opening. The door was here. Elara squeezed his hand gently, grounding him as his breath caught. Her eyes reflected the spiral above, shimmering with quiet awe. The choice pressed upon them, urgent yet calm, inevitable yet patient. Rick knew with a certainty deeper than thought that the next step would change everything. Not only their lives, but the very fabric of the world they thought they knew. They stood together, silent beneath the humming dome, the stars leaning closer, the stone alive between their hands. And though the moments stretched into stillness, Rick felt the future unfolding around them, vast and unending, waiting only for the courage to step through. The night of the spiral lingered in Rick's chest like a second heartbeat, refusing to quiet even after the stars had returned to their scattered in different places. He and Elara had left the observatory in silence, the stone cool again between them, yet every step back into the city felt as though they were walking along a seam that could split at any moment. The streets seemed sharper, more alive, each shadow holding the possibility of a door. He tried to ground himself in the ordinary. The slick sound of rain beneath his shoes, the faint glow of lamps against damp brick, but the hum threaded through it all, making the ordinary shimmer with a strangeness that would not be ignored. The following days passed in restless rhythm. Rick found it harder to sleep. His dreams no longer his own. Sometimes he wandered halls lined with doors, each one trembling with light, each one whispering in voices just beyond his understanding. Other nights he dreamt of vast corridors that bent and folded, places both infinite and claustrophobic, where his own footsteps echoed back at him in unfamiliar cadences. Elara admitted she too was dreaming, though her dreams felt less like wandering and more like being called. She would wake with words on her lips she could not remember, her hand pressed against her chest as if holding something within. Neither spoke of it to anyone else. The city had grown too still, too fragile, as though the air itself might shatter if they revealed what they carried. Rick noticed how even those around them seemed caught in a quiet unease. Street vendors lingered longer in silence. Children played more softly, and the clock tower that once chimed with punctual certainty now stuttered, its bells echoing out of rhythm. It was as if the whole city had become an echo chamber of their own unraveling. One evening, unable to bear the weight of silence, Rick asked Elara if she believed they were ready. The words slipped out more desperate than he had intended, and for a moment he regretted them. But Elara only looked at him, her expression calm but heavy, and said readiness was not a matter of choice. "The door opens when it must," she whispered, "and when it does, we walk." It was not long after that the hum reached its crescendo. They had returned to the observatory again, not because they expected it, but because there was nowhere else to go when the pull became unbearable. The dome was darker that night, the stars veiled by restless clouds, but inside the telescope glowed faintly as though remembering the spiral. The stone pulsed before they even placed it down, light spilling between their fingers. Then the air thickened, folding in on itself, and the observatory dissolved around them. This time they did not find themselves adrift in shifting light. They stood before a single door, immense and unyielding, carved not of wood or stone, but of something fluid, as though shadow and starlight had been woven together into a surface that symbols crawled across it, spirals, sigils, echoes of the patterns Alara had once traced against glass, and each pulse of the stone in Rick's hand caused the door to shiver, as though waiting. He felt fear tighten his throat, but Alara's hand found his again, steadying him. They pressed the stone against the surface, and the door opened without sound. Beyond was not light nor darkness, but something in between, a shifting twilight that carried the scent of rain and the sound of distant tides. They stepped through together. The world beyond was vast, a landscape both alien and achingly familiar. Towers rose like frozen waves, their surfaces reflecting stars that did not belong to any sky Rick had ever seen. Pathways spiraled outward in impossible geometry, roads leading in every direction, yet always circling back toward the center, where a great fissure glowed with molten light. The hum here was deafening, not in volume but in presence, saturating the air, until every breath was heavy with it. Rick staggered, overwhelmed, but Alara stood still, her eyes wide, reflecting the fissure's glow. "This is the threshold," she whispered, awe trembling in her voice. "This is where it begins." They walked slowly, their steps cautious but drawn forward by the inevitability of it. Each path shifted beneath their feet, sometimes solid stone, sometimes rippling water, sometimes nothing at all. The fissure loomed larger as they approached, and from within its light shapes began to emerge. Figures of crystalline forms, tall and silent, their gazes fixed upon the two travelers. Rick recognized the presence immediately. Ice was among them. The crystalline figure stepped forward, its movements graceful yet unyielding. Its voice entered not through ears but through thought, resonant and vast. "You have seen the doors. You have chosen to walk. Now you must witness." The fissure widened, and Rick's vision blurred. Images poured into him, worlds collapsing and reforming, endless corridors of light, echoes of lives not his own, but carried in his blood. He saw himself standing in 1,000 places, always holding the stone, always at the edge of a choice. He gasped, knees buckling, but Alara's hand anchored him, keeping him from falling entirely into the torrent. She too was trembling, her face pale but her eyes sharp with determination. "Show us," she whispered into the vastness, her voice steady. "Show us why we were called." And the fissure obeyed. The light surged upward, swallowing them both. They were pulled into visions that no longer belonged to past or future, but something greater, a weaving of every thread, every door, every threshold waiting to be crossed. Time stretched thin, and they were carried deeper toward the heart of what awaited them. They did not know if they would return to the observatory, to their city, or even to themselves as they had been. But as the fissure closed around them, Rick realized the truth that had lingered since the first hymn. The journey was not about answers, but about stepping forward despite not knowing. And with Alara beside him, hand locked with his, he knew he would walk until the very end of whatever path awaited. The vision deepened, and the world they once knew fell entirely away. The light engulfed Rick and Alara until their bodies seemed to dissolve, unmoored from weight and form. There was no ground beneath them, no sky above, only a horizonless expanse where sound and color bled into one another. Yet within that shifting brilliance, a pattern emerged. Threads of light weaving themselves into corridors, doors, and shifting halls that spiraled into infinity. It was as though the fissure had poured them directly into the architecture of existence, a place not meant to be seen but only felt, now laid bare before them. Rick tried to steady his breathing, though breath itself felt unnecessary here. His mind reeled as visions flickered across the endless expanse, fragments of worlds burning out like candle flames, others blooming into existence as if stitched together from whispers and starlight. Every image pressed into him like memories he should have had, but never lived. He saw himself in different forms, walking down hallways of glass, stepping into storms of fire, carrying the same stone that pulsed now in his palm. Each version of himself looked forward, never back, as though bound to the same endless journey. Beside him, Alara's gaze remained fixed, not outward but inward, her brow furrowed in concentration. Rick sensed she was seeing something different, where his visions fractured into multitudes of himself. Hers seemed focused, singular. She whispered words too soft for him to hear, as though repeating instructions she alone could decipher. Her hand tightened on his, grounding him when the weight of countless selves threatened to tear him apart. Then the crystalline figures appeared again, stepping out of the light. They were neither near nor far, existing in every direction at once, their presence overwhelming yet calm. Ice's voice entered Rick's mind, sharper now. Each word like a chord struck across a great instrument. What you see are echoes of possibility, threads woven, threads severed. You are not singular, but part of a lattice that spans beyond comprehension. Every step you take binds you to it more deeply. Rick wanted to ask what it meant, whether he was destined or merely chosen by chance, but the words withered on his tongue. Instead, Alara spoke, her voice steady though her hands trembled. Why us? Why show us this? What are we being prepared for? The fissure pulsed in answer, and suddenly the light folded, collapsing into a vision so sharp and clear it felt more real than anything they had yet seen. They stood upon a cliff of obsidian overlooking an ocean that churned with starlight instead of water. The waves rose higher and higher, reaching toward the land as though hungry, each crest foaming into the shape of doors that dissolved before breaking against the rocks. At the center of the ocean, a spire rose, black and infinite, its surface etched with the same symbols that marked the door they had entered. From its peak, a hum deeper than all the others reverberated, resonating in their bones. Ice's voice carried through the vision. There is a fracture within the lattice, a wound that spreads. If left unhealed, all doors will collapse, all corridors unravel, until only silence remains. You have been drawn because you are both key and fracture, bearer and witness. The stone you carry is not an artifact, it is an anchor. Without it, the lattice cannot endure. Rick looked down at the pulsing stone in his hand, its light matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time, he felt its weight not as a burden but as something alive, an entity that had chosen him as much as he had chosen to hold it. His chest tightened with both fear and responsibility, and he forced himself to meet the crystalline gaze before him. And if I fail? The figures did not answer in words. Instead, the ocean surged higher, swallowing the cliff where they stood. Rick braced for impact, but instead of drowning, he and Alara were carried within the tide, flung through corridors of light that bent and twisted around them. They tumbled through door after door, each one flashing fragments of worlds. A desert city swallowed by sand, a forest growing upside down beneath a sky of glass, a lonely figure writing names into an endless book. Each vision pressed into them until Rick could no longer separate what was memory, dream, or possibility. At last they landed on solid ground again. The air was cooler here. Quiet, though, the hum still vibrated beneath the silence. Before them stretched a narrow bridge of stone, suspended over a void that had no bottom. At its end stood a single door, taller than any they had seen, its frame carved with symbols that glowed faintly as though waiting for recognition. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, and she whispered, "That's the core." Rick did not know how she knew, but he believed her. The door radiated a gravity that drew him forward, though every step across the bridge felt heavier, as though the void below pressed upward to pull him in. He clutched the stone tighter, its pulse guiding his stride, until he and Alara stood before the door. This time, the figures did not speak. Instead, the fissure itself seemed to whisper, voices layered and endless, urging them closer. Rick pressed the stone against the door, expecting it to open as before. But the surface did not yield. Instead, the symbols flared brighter, and a rush of heat seared through his arm, flooding his chest until he cried out. Alara grabbed him, steadying him, and the light from the stone burst outward, enveloping them both. They were pulled again, not through space, but inward. Rick felt his mind unravel, threads tugged loose until he no longer knew where he ended and the lattice began. He glimpsed Alara beside him, her face illuminated, her eyes wide with both fear and wonder. They were no longer just witnesses. They were becoming part of the pattern woven into the very structure they had been shown. The last thing Rick heard before everything dissolved into light was Ice's voice, faint but resolute. "The door will test you. Do not mistake it for passage. It is reflection. What you bring into it will shape what lies beyond." And then the door opened, not outward but inward, pulling them into the core of what awaited. The pull of the door was unlike anything Rick had known. Neither violent nor gentle, but absolute, as though resistance had never been an option. The light folded him inward, curling around his mind like smoke, until the distinction between thought and reality thinned to a fragile veil. He staggered, though there was no ground beneath his feet, and when his vision steadied, he was standing inside what looked like a hallway built of memory itself. The walls shimmered, constructed not of stone or metal, but scenes from his life flickering like film strips pressed into crystal. At first, the images were faint, fractured glimpses that slipped away if he tried to focus too closely. A table where half-finished inventions lay scattered, a soft lullaby carried on air he couldn't place, a face that blurred each time he reached toward it, but as he walked, the fragments grew sharper, more insistent, until he could no longer look away. The corridor seemed to feed from him, pulling what was hidden deep inside into the light. He recognized the smell of solder and burnt circuits, the sting of harsh laughter from voices that once told him he was wasting his time, and the echo of his own silence as he pushed the world aside in pursuit of something larger. Alara's hand brushed his arm, grounding him. She stood beside him, her eyes fixed forward, yet he knew she was seeing something entirely her own. Her expression was caught between awe and unease, as though she were stepping through a gallery of her soul laid bare. "It's not showing us where to go," she whispered. "It's showing us who we are." Rick nodded faintly, though the words didn't ease the weight pressing against his chest. A door shimmered at the end of the hallway, yet every step toward it triggered another vision to rise before him. This time it was his own reflection, younger and unscarred, standing in the corridor's center. The younger Rick tilted his head, eyes alight with a fire. Rick remembered too well the insatiable hunger for knowledge, the arrogance of certainty, the loneliness hidden beneath it. "You think you've changed," the reflection said, though its lips never moved. "But you still run from the same emptiness. You build, you destroy, you hide behind brilliance. And yet you've never answered the one question you fear most." Rick clenched the stone in his hand, the pulse of its light synchronizing with his racing heart. "And what's that?" The younger self leaned closer, voice like static woven into truth. "Who are you when there's no one left to impress? No one left to save, no one left to love you anyway?" The words landed heavy, and for a moment Rick couldn't speak. He felt the ache of years pressing against him, of doors slammed shut, of bonds half-kept and half-abandoned. Alara reached for him again, but the reflection's eyes flickered toward her, and suddenly the space shifted. Now Alara's reflection stood across from her, silent but searing, her expression carved from every choice she had doubted, every moment she had hesitated. The air between them thickened with unspoken grief, unhealed scars.
Rick realized then what I said meant.
This wasn't a door of passage, but of reflection. A trial not of strength, but of truth. To step forward, they would have to confront themselves, not the world outside. He swallowed hard, forcing his gaze back to his own younger self, and whispered, "I'm not who I was. I may never be who I should have been. But I'm still here, still holding on, still trying, and maybe that's enough." The reflection tilted its head, as though weighing the answer. Slowly, it stepped backward, dissolving into light that folded back into the walls. The hallway eased around him, its pressure loosening like a held breath released. Rick turned toward Alara, watching as she faced her own silent twin. She stood frozen, her fists clenched, tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes. Rick wanted to reach for her, but something told him this part she had to walk alone. At last, Alara exhaled. "I'm not perfect," she whispered to her reflection. "But I'm not defined by what I failed to do. I'm defined by what I choose to carry forward." Her reflection gave no reply, only softened, fading into the air like mist. The corridor dimmed, and the door at the end glowed brighter, symbols across its surface pulsing in rhythm with the stone Rick carried. Together, they stepped forward, the silence of the hallway now filled with a quiet strength rather than fear. When they reached the door, it opened without resistance. On the other side lay not light nor void, but a vast chamber that felt both endless and intimate. The ceiling was a canopy of stars, yet each star pulsed like a heartbeat, echoing with the rhythm of their own. In the chamber's center stood a pedestal, upon which rested a mirror of pure obsidian, its surface rippling as though alive. The hum of the lattice filled the air, and Rick realized this was the core of the reflection, the place where everything converged. Ice's voice drifted faintly, more distant than before, as though strained by the weight of the chamber. "You have faced yourselves, now face the lattice. What you give it will shape what remains." Rick exchanged a glance with Alara, her eyes shining with determination. The stone in his palm pulsed hotter, urging him forward. He felt the mirror drawing him in, calling for the truth of who he was, who he had been, and who he might yet become. His heart thudded, not with fear but with the quiet, aching weight of honesty. Together, they stepped toward the mirror, its surface rippling wider, ready to receive them. Rick inhaled deeply, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to believe that whatever waited on the other side might not be destruction, but renewal. And as their reflections reached out from the mirror to meet them, the chamber held its breath, waiting to see what they would bring. The mirror's surface rippled as Rick and Alara drew closer, its black sheen folding into itself as though it were a living thing breathing in anticipation. For a heartbeat, Rick thought he saw only his own reflection staring back at him, but then the glass shifted, and what looked back was not him as he was, but 1,000 variations, older, younger, triumphant, broken, loved, abandoned, all flickering across the surface like cards shuffled too quickly to grasp. Alara gasped softly beside him, her hand brushing his sleeve as though to anchor herself, for the mirror had turned its gaze upon her too, showing lives she had not lived but could have, each one sharp with the ache of possibility. The hum of the lattice swelled, filling the chamber until it pressed against their skin, and the mirror pulsed as though demanding something not yet given. Rick felt the weight of the stone in his palm, its rhythm syncing with the stars above, and instinctively he raised it toward the glass. The moment it touched, the mirror rippled outward, engulfing both him and Alara in a flood of light. They were pulled inside, their bodies dissolving again, yet this time it felt different, not like falling, not like unraveling, but like stepping into the bloodstream of existence itself. They found themselves standing in a vast plain of shifting silver, a horizon that had no edges, only movement. Every direction shimmered with echoes of voices, some recognizable, some strange, each whispering fragments of truth. The mirror had become a passage, but not to a place in the way they understood. It had brought them into the lattice heart, where all possibilities converged. Rick turned, his chest tightening as shapes began to emerge from the silver, figures of people he had known, and others he had only half remembered from dreams. His mother's smile blurred and fragile, a friend he'd pushed away long ago. Even Morty, but not as he was, different somehow, older, wiser, standing with a gravity Rick hadn't yet seen in him. Alara's figures were different, yet no less piercing. A mentor's steady hand guiding her once more, a child's laugh she hadn't heard in years. Echoing in the distance, shadows of her own doubts, walking beside her like companions she had never truly shaken. The plane wasn't showing them illusions, it was showing them what lay beneath their surfaces. The threads of connection that bound them to all they had touched and all they had turned away from. The voices grew louder, layering until they became almost unbearable. Choose, they whispered, though the word was less command than inevitability. Rick stumbled forward, clutching the stone tighter, his knuckles white. The plane shifted beneath him, forming paths that split and merged, each one lit by faint symbols that mirrored the ones etched into the chamber door. He realized then what the mirror demanded. This wasn't about reflection anymore. It was about direction. What they carried forward into the lattice would determine not just their own journey but the fate of all corridors tied to them. Alara's voice trembled as she asked, "How can we possibly know which path is right?" Rick shook his head slowly, though he didn't stop moving. Maybe it's not about right. Maybe it's about truth. About what we're willing to live with. The paths pulsed brighter as they walked, each one revealing glimpses of what might lie ahead. One showed Rick returning to his lab, pouring himself into endless work, keeping the lattice alive through sheer determination but losing everyone close to him along the way. Another showed him abandoning it entirely, letting the lattice collapse while clinging to Alara and the fragile peace of solitude, though the worlds beyond dissolved into silence. A third path flickered faintly, harder to see, but in it he stood not alone and not obsessed, but alongside others. Morty, Alara, even Ice, each one holding a piece of the burden, the lattice stabilized not by one man's brilliance, but by shared weight. Rick's throat tightened. That third vision shimmered with warmth he hadn't allowed himself to trust in years, but its fragility frightened him. He knew the cost of relying on others, the chance they'd leave, or falter, or break under the weight. Yet he also knew the loneliness of carrying everything alone, and the devastation of surrendering entirely. The stone pulsed harder, as though urging him toward the balance he had always resisted. And Lara touched his arm, her voice steadier now. "I think the lattice doesn't want perfection. It wants honesty. It wants what's real, even if it's uncertain." Her words lingered in him, sinking deeper than he expected. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he stepped toward the faint, fragile path. The mirror flared with light, brighter than before, and the plane dissolved around them. They were pulled upward through streams of silver, until they were back in the chamber beneath the canopy of stars. The mirror now reflected, not fractured selves, but a singular, steady image. Rick and Alara standing side by side, the stone glowing between them, their reflections unified. Ice's voice returned, clearer this time, though tinged with weariness. "You have chosen balance. You have chosen to share the burden. The lattice will bend, but it will not break. Remember this, what is carried together endures longer than what is carried alone." The chamber grew still, and for a moment, Rick allowed himself to breathe. The weight hadn't vanished, but it felt lighter, steadier, as though anchored by something beyond himself. He glanced at Alara, who nodded faintly, her eyes glimmering with quiet resolve. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was walking into the unknown as a solitary figure. Yet even as calm settled, the stars above shifted, their glow dimming slightly, as though signaling that the trial was not yet complete. The mirror remained open, rippling softly, waiting for the next step. Rick knew there was more ahead, something beyond reflection, beyond choice, something final. And with the stone pulsing warmly in his palm, he braced himself for what the mirror would show next. The mirror's surface quivered as if stirred by a breath from some unseen mouth, its ripples spreading outward in slow, deliberate waves. Rick stared into it, stone clenched tightly in his palm, feeling the weight of Ice's words still lingering in his mind. Balance, shared burden ideas. He had never trusted ideas that felt fragile compared to the certainty of cold logic. Yet here, beneath the shifting stars and the pulsing heartbeat of the lattice, he couldn't deny that the choice had already changed something inside him. The mirror was no longer a reflection of countless fractured selves. It was alive with possibility, waiting for them to step deeper. Alara's gaze was fixed on the surface, her eyes wide as though seeing a horizon only she could decipher. Her breath was steady now, no longer shaken by fear, but guided by determination. "It's not finished," she whispered, almost reverently. "The lattice doesn't just test what we carry. It wants to show us what we'll become if we fail to honor it." The surface trembled, and then the chamber dimmed until only the glow of the mirror remained. A low hum rolled through the ground, rattling the air in their lungs, and suddenly the ripples on the glass broke apart into images, visions stretching forward in time. Rick stepped closer despite himself, drawn into the unfolding story. The first vision showed a collapse, the lattice broken and frayed, its threads unraveling into infinite void. Worlds blinked out like candle flames snuffed by an indifferent hand. Rick saw himself standing alone in the wreckage, still alive but hollow, surrounded by silence so absolute it suffocated. His brilliance hadn't saved him. His stubborn refusal to lean on anyone had left him the last ghost of an extinguished universe. The second vision flickered into place, brighter at first, filled with voices and laughter. Rick and Alara together, their journey extending beyond the lattice's chamber. Morty was there too, older and steadier, standing beside him not as a burden but as an equal. The lattice thrummed steadily in the background, not perfect, always demanding care, but alive because its weight was carried by many hands. Yet even within this warmth, shadows lingered, moments of doubt, fractures of trust, the ever-present temptation to retreat back into isolation. The vision warned that balance was not a one-time choice but a constant act of courage, one that could falter at any moment. Then came the third vision, darker than both. Not silence, not balance, but domination. Rick saw himself wielding the stone like a weapon, bending the lattice, not into harmony but into submission. Power surged through him, endless and intoxicating, rewriting the structure of existence according to his design. But the cost was plain. Alara's absence, Morty's defiance, the lattice itself trembling under the strain of control rather than connection. It was survival, yes, but a brittle, tyrannical survival that would eventually collapse beneath the weight of one man's hubris. Rick's jaw tightened as he watched, the edges of the vision searing into him like fire. The mirror wasn't offering choices now, it was revealing consequences. It was forcing him to see what lay ahead if he strayed from the path he had chosen, and deep inside, though he hated to admit it, the most tempting vision was the third: control. Certainty, no vulnerability, no risk of being let down, but also no one beside him, no laughter echoing through the halls of existence, no warmth in the silence. Alara turned to him, her expression etched with both fear and resolve. "These aren't destinies, they're warnings. The lattice is asking if we understand what we've chosen, and if we're willing to keep choosing it, no matter how difficult it becomes." Rick exhaled slowly, the weight of her words pressing into him. He wanted to argue, to dismiss it all as cosmic theatrics, but he couldn't. Not here, not now, not with the stone pulsing in rhythm with the stars and the mirror holding up truths he could no longer outrun. The chamber shook suddenly, a deep tremor rolling through its walls. The vision shattered, the mirror's surface returning to black glass that reflected only the two of them. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was waiting, poised like a question hanging in the air. Rick realized then that the mirror wasn't done. It had shown him possible futures, but now it demanded action, a final step. Without speaking, he placed the stone against the mirror once more. This time the surface didn't ripple outward. It pulled inward, swallowing the stone, then expanding to swallow him in a Lara hole. They were thrust forward through a tunnel of light and shadow, the fabric of the lattice twisting around them like veins of living energy. Voices whispered in countless tongues, each one carrying fragments of truth and warning, until they burst through into a new expanse. They stood on a precipice, overlooking a vast network of threads stretching infinitely in every direction. It was the lattice itself, no longer hidden behind symbols and chambers, but raw and immense, glowing like a galaxy made of veins of fire and silver. Each thread pulsed faintly, some steady, some frayed, some flickering on the edge of collapse. Rick felt his chest seize at the sight. It was both beautiful and terrifying, infinite yet fragile. Alara gripped his arm tightly. This is it. The heart of everything. A voice resonated around them, not ice this time, but something deeper, older, woven from the lattice itself. You have seen reflection. You have seen consequence. Now you will be tested in creation. The lattice must know not only what you carry, but what you will leave behind. Rick's throat dried. This wasn't about choosing paths anymore. It was about building one. He glanced at Alara, whose eyes shone with fear and determination, and felt the stone's absence where it had been pulled into the lattice. The test was no longer in his hand. It was in him. The threads below them pulsed brighter, waiting for his touch, and Rick, for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt the crushing weight of legacy pressing against his chest. Not the legacy of inventions or victories, but of choices, of what remained after he was gone. He swallowed hard, realizing that the next step would not only bind his fate but carve the memory of who he truly was into the fabric of existence. And with Alara's hand steady on his arm, he stepped forward toward the threads. The threads stretched before Rick and Alara like rivers of fire suspended in endless night, each one carrying the hum of worlds, the whispers of choices long past, and the fragile weight of futures still unborn. Standing at the edge of that vast web, Rick felt as though the universe itself had stripped him bare, leaving no inventions, no bravado, no excuses, only the truth of what he would dare to shape. His hands twitched with the old instinct to control, to impose order through force, but the lattice pulsed softly in warning, reminding him of the visions it had shown. Power twisted into tyranny, isolation into ruin, balance into fragile, fleeting hope. Alara's grip on his arm steadied him, her voice a whisper that somehow carried through the infinite hum. It's not about bending it, it's about listening first. Let the threads tell us where we belong before we try to weave. Rick exhaled sharply through his nose, annoyed by how simple she made it sound, yet beneath the sarcasm rising in his throat, he knew she was right. This wasn't a machine to rewire or a puzzle to brute force. The lattice demanded humility, a quality he had buried under years of defiance. Still, he forced himself to kneel, pressing his palm near one of the glowing strands. The moment his skin met the air above it, a surge of sensation tore through him. Images cascaded like floods, the laughter of Morty echoing in a garage cluttered with half-finished inventions, the rage of enemies across galaxies scorched by his brilliance, the quiet, unbearable weight of nights when silence pressed harder than gravity. Each thread vibrated with pieces of him, fragments of a self he had scattered through lifetimes of choices. Alara joined him, her hand brushing another thread, her visions intertwined with his echoes of her people's exile, the cries of voices she could never save, the flicker of hope she carried like a fragile flame. The threads seemed to respond, growing brighter where their emotions overlapped, dimmer where dissonance pulled them apart. Rick realized then what the lattice truly demanded, not just balance within himself, but resonance between them. Alone, their notes wavered. Incomplete, together they began to hum with something that could endure. The voice of the lattice rolled through them again, vast and resonant. To weave is to risk, to bind is to surrender part of yourself, so that what remains can endure beyond you. Choose your strand. Offer it. Rick's chest tightened. Offer it. He thought of what that might mean. A piece of his knowledge, his identity, his freedom. The temptation to hesitate gnawed at him, but hesitation here felt like betrayal, not just to Alara, but to the fragile pulse of the universe itself. We'll go first, he muttered, more to convince himself than her. Reaching deep into the current of threads, he found one that thrummed with a rhythm painfully familiar, an echo of Morty's voice. Younger, uncertain, always looking to him for guidance. The thread pulsed with warmth, a reminder of what he had nearly broken time and again. Rick clenched his jaw, and with a sharp exhale, he pressed his hand fully against it. The strand absorbed him, pulling a fragment of his essence like a flame caught in its weave. He staggered, nearly collapsing as the thread brightened with a steady, golden glow. In that instant, he felt a hollow open in him, an emptiness where certainty had once lived. He had given up something, control perhaps, or the illusion that he could stand apart forever. Yet the lattice accepted it, the hum stabilizing into a firmer rhythm. Alara followed, her gaze fierce despite the tremor in her hands. She chose a thread vibrating with sorrow, one bound to the faces of those she could never save. With tears glinting at the edge of her lashes, she pressed her hand against it. The lattice drank in her grief, reshaping it into a softer light. When she pulled away, she swayed but did not fall. Her strength had been carved into the fabric now, no longer hers alone to bear. Together, their chosen threads wove upward, intertwining like vines, reaching for the stars. The lattice shifted in response, opening a path deeper into its heart. Yet the air grew colder, the threads around them flickering with instability. The sacrifice was not without consequence. The lattice demanded equilibrium. An imbalance in one corner of its web could ripple outward to threaten all. Rick cursed under his breath. Of course it can't just take the damn offering and call it a day. No, it has to test us again. Alara steadied herself beside him. It's not punishment. It's a reminder. The lattice isn't fixed, it's alive. Every choice we make shapes how it breathes. The path stretched forward, winding through strands that sparked and hissed like frayed wires. Some threads snapped outright, their ends curling back like burned parchment. Rick felt the weight of what they carried intensify, as though the lattice leaned closer, testing not just their strength but their resolve to move forward without faltering. As they stepped carefully onto the shimmering pathway, the air around them thickened with voices. They weren't words exactly, but echoes, shadows of futures that could collapse if they misstepped. One thread brushed against Rick's shoulder, and he caught a glimpse of himself falling back into old patterns, abandoning Alara the moment survival grew costly. Another grazed Alara, showing her the temptation of surrender, to let despair overwhelm her and fade into the lattice's silence. Each thread was a temptation, a warning, a test. At the path's midpoint, the strands converged into a single blazing knot, a core of tangled light trembling with instability. Rick knew instantly this was the fracture point, the place where the lattice would either mend or break under their influence. The voice of the lattice surged once more, louder now, impossible to ignore. Together or alone, the knot must be rewoven. But beware, if your wills divide, the weave will unravel. Choose how you bind it. Rick glanced at Alara, his chest heavy with the weight of what lay before them. He had always thrived on working alone, his genius unshackled by compromise. Yet here, compromise wasn't weakness. It was survival, and maybe, just maybe, something more. His voice cracked the silence. We do this together. No other way. Alara's answering nod was fierce. Without hesitation, they stepped forward, hands reaching for the trembling knot of light. The instant they touched it, the lattice roared, energy coursing through their veins, forcing their thoughts, fears, and hopes into violent collision. It was not gentle. It demanded everything. But in that chaos, something extraordinary began to form. Not dominance, not surrender, but a resonance that held even as the storm threatened to tear them apart. The knot shuddered, then began to unravel, threads whipping wildly into the void. Rick gritted his teeth, forcing his mind to stay aligned with Alara's, refusing to let his instinct to seize control overwhelm the fragile harmony they had built. And as the last thread slipped free, they began weaving anew. Not perfect, not flawless, but strong enough to hold. When the knot sealed, the lattice stilled. The roaring hum softened into a steady pulse that rippled outward into the endless web, mending frayed strands, rekindling dim sparks. For the first time since stepping into this place, Rick felt something he hadn't dared believe in. Not certainty, not power, but trust. He collapsed to his knees, breath ragged, the glow of the newly woven knot still burning in his vision. Alara knelt beside him, her face pale but her eyes alive with triumph. They had given something away, risked everything, and yet in return they had forged a bond stronger than either could have imagined. The lattice's voice, softer now, resonated through them one final time. The weave holds, but the journey is not done. What you have mended must be carried. What you have bound must be lived. Rick's lips twisted into a wry, exhausted smile. Figures. No rest for the multiversal caretakers. But beneath the sarcasm, he felt the truth of it sink deep. They had stepped into something far larger than themselves, and now, for better or worse, they carried the heartbeat of eternity in their hands. When the light of the lattice dimmed into a steady glow and the hum softened to a near-silent thrum, Rick felt the ground beneath him reform. It wasn't solid in the way a floor should be, but it was enough to hold him. His breath came in sharp pulls, each exhale heavy with exhaustion and yet tinged with something more fragile, acceptance. Alara knelt beside him, her hand still hovering near his shoulder as if unsure whether he needed steadying or solitude. The knot they had rewoven pulsed behind them, no longer trembling with chaos, but resonating with a quiet strength that rippled outward, mending fractures across the endless weave. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply existed in the silence, feeling the weight of what had shifted. But silence is never eternal, not even here. Slowly, the threads around them began to shift again, not in violent unraveling but in graceful adjustment, as though the lattice itself was aligning to a new rhythm. And in that alignment came change. A shimmer opened before them, a threshold of light that was neither doorway nor portal, yet beckoned with undeniable intent. Halara's gaze fixed on it, her expression a mixture of awe and weariness. "It wants us to leave." Rick rubbed a trembling hand across his face, muttering under his breath, "Yeah, well, it's about damn time." But beneath the flippant tone was a flicker of unease. Leaving meant returning, and returning meant facing a world altered by the choices they'd just sealed into the very fabric of reality. Still, there was no other path. Together, they stepped into the light. The shift was subtle at first, like walking out of a deep dream. Colors sharpened, gravity reasserted itself, and the air once again carried the familiar scent of earth and atmosphere. But it didn't take long for Rick to notice what was different. The stars above burned brighter, as though polished clean. The horizon seemed to breathe, wider and more expansive, yet softer too. Even the silence between sounds, wind through leaves, distant water flowing, was fuller, richer. Morty's voice broke that silence, uncertain and small. "Ready, Rick." Rick turned sharply. Morty stood a few paces away, his posture stiff, his eyes wide with something Rick couldn't immediately read. Fear, maybe, or reverence. Behind him, other figures began to emerge. Familiar faces, unfamiliar ones. Echoes of people who shouldn't have been there at all. For an instant, Rick felt his gut twist. The lattice hadn't just mended itself, it had reshaped the fabric of the world outside. Some who had been lost were standing once more, while others who should have been present were now nothing more than memory. Alara's breath caught as she spotted one of her own people among the crowd, a figure she thought forever gone. Her steps faltered, torn between rushing forward and standing frozen, afraid that the vision would dissolve if she moved too quickly. The reunion that should have been joy carried a shadow. Rick could feel it in the way Morty didn't run to him, in the way the crowd's murmurs carried unease instead of relief. They weren't looking at him as family or savior. They were looking at him as something altered, someone who had touched the threads of eternity and returned carrying pieces of it in his very presence. Rick forced a crooked smirk, trying to mask the heaviness in his chest. "What? You were expecting balloons in a parade? Sorry to disappoint." But the joke fell flat. Morty's eyes dropped, his voice barely above a whisper. "You changed things, didn't you? It doesn't feel the same anymore." Rick wanted to deny it, to push back with one of his usual tirades, but he couldn't. Because Morty was right. The balance they had woven inside the lattice was now etched into the bones of reality itself. Threads had shifted. Choices had rewritten echoes. This world was familiar but not identical. It carried the scars of sacrifice, the light of renewal, and the unspoken truth that nothing could return to exactly what it was. Alara stepped forward, her voice steadier than Rick's. "What's different isn't wrong. It's just new. We gave up pieces of ourselves so this could survive. That kind of change leaves marks." Her words steadied some, but not all. Rick noticed the way certain faces in the crowd stiffened, the way whispers spread like cracks in glass. There would be gratitude, yes, but there would also be doubt, fear, resentment. Not everyone would accept what had been reshaped, especially when the shape of loss lingered alongside the gift of restoration. Rick swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had spent his life outrunning consequences, burying them under intellect and invention. But here there was no escape. The lattice's final words echoed in his head. "What you have mended must be carried." The weight pressed down, yet he found he wasn't entirely alone beneath it. Alara's presence was constant, her hand brushing his once more, grounding him. For the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Rick let himself lean, just a fraction, into someone else's steadiness. Night deepened overhead, the stars humming faintly as though acknowledging their altered design. The crowd began to disperse, some in relief, others in quiet unrest. Morty lingered, hesitant, his gaze caught between resentment and yearning. Rick met his eyes and saw the reflection of every failure, every attempt to hold too much alone, every thread that had nearly snapped under his hand. "I screwed up plenty," Rick said quietly, his usual edge blunted, worn down to something raw. "But this time, I tried to fix more than just myself. That's gotta count for something, right?" Morty didn't answer at first. Then slowly he stepped closer, just enough that the space between them didn't feel like a chasm anymore. I guess, we'll see. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Rick realized, were just another kind of weaving, fragile, imperfect, but capable of holding, if tended carefully. As the night stretched on, Rick tilted his head back, watching the stars pulse with that quiet, altered rhythm. The world felt both heavier and lighter all at once. He knew the journey wasn't finished. There would always be new knots, new fractures, new choices demanding sacrifice. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was walking into it alone. Alara's voice, soft and steady, broke the silence one last time. The weave holds because we hold it together. Remember that, Rick? I didn't argue. He just let the words settle into him, like thread stitching into a fabric he hadn't realized was still fraying. And somewhere in that fragile, shifting stillness, Rick allowed himself a rare, fleeting peace.